Hello, this video continues our lesson on how to use the short-run New Keynesian model to obtain numerical results. In the previous video, we learned about how shocks of different kinds affected the equilibrium output gap. We learned that there's a negative relationship between the expectations gap of inflation and the output gap. So if inflation expectations rise relative to the target inflation, then what will happen is that the central bank, in order to bolster its credibility, will raise interest rates, and that's going to squeeze out demand, and that's going to reduce the output gap. Conversely, if we have a decrease in the expectations gap, if people expect inflation to be lower than the target, then the central bank will have to reduce interest rates and encourage aggregate demand, and that'll mean an increase in the output gap. So there's a negative relationship here between the expectations gap and the output gap. In terms of productivity-based shocks, it shouldn't be any surprise that there's a positive relationship when we have a favorable shock, a rightward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve, let's say a reduction in oil prices or a more favorable harvest. That's going to increase the output gap. Alternatively, if we have an adverse shock, that's a leftward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve, that's going to reduce our output gap. So for example, if oil prices go up, then the output gap will go down. Once again, this happens partly through the interest rate mechanism. So if we have a favorable supply shock, the central bank can reduce interest rates. If we have an adverse supply shock, the central bank will raise interest rates. Our third effect here is the aggregate demand effect. That also shouldn't be a surprise that we have a positive relationship. So if we have an increase in aggregate demand as reflected in a rightward shift of the IS curve, that's going to increase the output gap. And if we have a leftward shift of the IS curve reflecting a decrease in aggregate demand, that will decrease the output gap. Now, as we learned, that the equilibrium increase in the output gap is going to be less than the shock, the magnitude of the shift to the IS curve. Why? Because when we have an increase in aggregate demand, the central bank that stays on its Taylor rule will raise interest rates, and it will squeeze out some of that aggregate demand. Conversely, if we have a decrease in aggregate demand, a leftward shift of the IS curve, that means that the central bank will reduce interest rates, so the magnitude of the shift here in the gap is going to be less than the magnitude of the original shift in the IS curve. Lastly, discretionary monetary policy. You shouldn't be any surprise that that has a negative effect when the central bank raises interest rates on a discretionary basis. We'll see that's a leftward shift to the RT curve. That's going to mean that the demand elements, consumption, and especially investment, are going to be squeezed out, and that's going to reduce the output gap. Alternatively, if we have a discretionary loosening, that's a reduction in interest rates, that's going to mean that the central bank is encouraging more demand, and that'll increase the output gap. So what we did in the last slide was we took these common sense notions and we showed that actually they were borne out in the mathematics. So now, our step 2, we want to get the equilibrium real interest rate, we want to get the equilibrium inflation rate, and then we want to get the equilibrium nominal interest rate. How do we do that? Well, if we already did this calculation here for the gap, then we take the equilibrium gap along with all of the other elements of these equations, and we plug them in. So here in the Taylor rule, we plug in the equilibrium output gap alongside our natural rate of interest, our expectations gap, and our assumption for shock to the short-run aggregate supply curve, the PBS, and any discretionary elements to monetary policy, and that will give us our real interest rate. And then over here, this is our Phillips curve. We plug in our expected inflation, our equilibrium gap, and our productivity-based shock to the short-run aggregate supply curve, and we will get our equilibrium inflation. And finally, to get the nominal rate of interest, we're going to calculate this the easy way. We're just going to take the real rate of interest plus the inflation rate, and that'll get us the nominal interest rate.